Thank you, Janet. So Janet, I said I got the last word. True to form, gave me the challenge and the honor of introducing Miss Claudine Rankine, and then added to the challenge by saying, and don't read the bio. And I'm like, who does that? You know what I mean? Like, normally you introduce people, you read the bio, you sit down. So that became something that I wanted to think a lot about. But I knew it would be an honor to introduce Miss Rankine. And before doing that, though, I want to say, though, back to you, Janet, that the opportunity to do the racial equity work, the opportunity to do work with groups like the People's Institute, to take seriously racism, to say white supremacy and GIA spaces, was a growth opportunity for me. And the work with the organization is the one board I'm going to actually leave and feel, in Portuguese, we would say saudades, like, oh, remembrances of what a nice experience that was. And this will be the one board that I'll have that experience. And I mean that. But to introduce Ms. Rankine, one of the things that I think is most impressive about her work, and you can read about the number of books that she's written, the one I think many of us are more familiar with now is Citizen, an American lyric. How many folks are familiar with that work? Yep. Great. Okay. I really recommend it to people. And for me, there's been a lot of talk about Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me. And I think Ms. Rankine's book, particularly for philanthropy, should be put right next to it when we're talking about important works. Because the world of microaggressions, these small incidences of racism that we experience that she talks about, is really, to me, the work of philanthropy. Those of us who work in philanthropy and don't have the privilege, and I put that in quotes there, of white skin, experience these microaggressions all the time in our work. We see it when we see how funding is allocated, we see it in small comments that are made, and her work talks about that. And for me, that is the real challenge of philanthropy that is something that we need to look at in terms of our practice. And so there's this one quote that I want to read. Janet gave me 5 minutes, so I got it going. But I want to read this one excerpt from Citizen. When the stranger asks, "Why do you care?" you just stand there staring at him. He has just referred to the boisterous teenagers in Starbucks as niggers. "Hey, I'm standing right here," you responded, not necessarily expecting him to turn to you. He is holding the lidded cup in one hand and a small paper bag in the other. "They are just being kids. Come on, no need to get all KKK on them," you say. "Now there you go," he responds. The people around you have turned away from their screens. The teenagers are on pause. "There I go," you ask, feeling irritation beginning to rain down. Yes, and something about hearing yourself repeating the stranger's accusation in a voice usually reserved for your partner makes you smile. And what I think, I was asking Ms. Rankine at lunch if the book was, in some sense, her response at other moments of silence in her life, moments that I could relate to, moments when I had been silent and not witnessed the racism that was right in front of me. And she said that for a long time she had been silent at certain moments, but this book was an engagement and a response, along with, I'm sure, other parts of her work. And so for me, this is what happens all the time in our offices when we hear underserved and all the various names, is what we're hearing. And so how do we engage so that we can feel proud of ourselves at night? Ms. Rankine said she had read a piece of mine and felt like she knew me from reading a number of the pieces. And I said to her, it's funny because I've written a few pieces of your work and I don't feel like I know you because of the complexity of what you're talking about and the complexity of her voice. And so while I could go on about that, I just want to take this moment to say what an honor it is to introduce Ms. Rankine, and that we can listen to her, I think, for how we would apply these ideas in our work where it has such an impact on the arts and cultural landscape. So with that, Ms. Rankine.
Good afternoon. My goodness, it's so nice to be here. It's this is hard, this writing of this thing. When Janet and Jim asked me, I thought, I know nothing about you people. And yet I depend on you. So it's really lovely to actually see the faces behind all of these institutions. I'm going to read okay. It is an honor to have been invited here to address a room full of people who love artists. As you have dedicated your lives to enable people like me to do their work. From behind the scenes with little recognition, you work tirelessly to make sure what is imagined takes tangible shape in our world. You have a direct relationship to artists and art making from your positions inside foundations. These foundations have power. This means all of you have a lot of power. Collectively, you decide. You recommend whose work should be supported monetarily and also institutionally. You decide whom to be in process with and for how long. You also help determine what processes should become a part of the culture. You make certain imaginings permissible. I am thinking here of your instrumental and supportive role in the development of institutions like Off-Broadway Theater, as well as various creative nonviolent organizations within the civil rights movement. I wouldn't have known that unless I read Justin's blog. I really do bow down to you. But I think I was invited here to ask you the same question I have been asking everyone around the country through my recent book, Citizen. How do your race politics affect, form, and shape both who you are and the thing you do? How does it determine what comes out your mouth as you move in intimate spaces at work, with colleagues, and among artists? What is the relationship between your love of the arts and your power to help determine what gets time to develop? How does both your love and your power determine the metrics of our public imagination? I love questions. That's my favorite mode. What do you see when you see work made by artists, all of whom are raced? Who's at the table while you are looking? Do you see differently depending on who is standing next to you? Do you have enough self-consciousness to be self-conscious about what you expect to see? Do you ever ask yourself what you are wanting from the work you see? What you are wanting from the work you do? What expectations do you have for our public imagination? Do you ever find yourself mistaking critical response for prohibition? It's interesting how many of us separate our decisions from the history and culture that made us. What gets established as supportable art? I know you already know what feels like it has a future sometimes feels that way because it is in the vernacular of what we already own. In the old days, which could be yesterday, we saw a world where white male artists were considered capable of speaking to and for all of us. Their supposed transcendent imagination was not dirtied up by race, gender, and sexuality. Institutions made a prize of their transcendence, and while never naming it white, named it white. And the whiteness of whiteness was something to be chased. It was aspired to by not only white artists. White meant normalcy and genius simultaneously. No one said this, but institutions were throwing money behind transcendence and giving transcendence time to develop his projects. Those projects were impressive and admirable or not. But more importantly, they were allowed to be everywhere, to exist. And because your institutions had added their names to his name, when he spoke, he was listened to. I had an anecdote I was going to tell you, and I went back and forth about, and I wrote it, and then I took it out. But now I'm going to tell you. My colleague at Pomona was the formidable David Foster Wallace. And he had gotten the MacArthur Genius Grant. And it was really interesting to sit in faculty meetings with him because, I mean, he was really a wonderful guy before he died. And I would say something like, I think we should change the color of the ceiling to yellow. And the meeting would go on. And then David would say, intentionally, I think we should change the ceiling to yellow. And everyone would say, that is such a great idea, David. Oh my God, did you hear that? David just said we should change the ceiling to yellow. And then David would say, actually, Claudia said that 20 minutes ago. So I miss him, actually. And because I'm going to back up to move forward. And because your institutions had added their names to his name, when he spoke, he was listened to. And what he did had value beyond perhaps its actual value. All this was happening because those before you sat in rooms and decided. This is not to suggest conspiratorially the decisions in the room were consciously exclusionary. Intention might be considered too aggressive a term when we consider institutional tendencies and personal prejudices that attach themselves to love and support of artists and art making. Then, as far as I can tell, things started to change, and you all led the change. Incredible changes took flight under your watch. Artists with other kinds of imaginations were being nurtured, sponsored, and brought forward into the public. And suddenly we began to understand the imagination as not transcendent, but as a decaying sense. That's in quotes. Or in other words, or more precisely, as memory. This is the definition the 17th century philosopher Thomas Hobbes offers us. And I just want to say, not that I agree with Hobbes on all counts, because, I mean, he had other ideas about democracy. But anyway, in Leviathan, where he says that the imagination and memory are but one thing. So change came with the broadening wisdom of an imagination that remembered what it had forgotten. An imagination that remembered that it hadn't been what it hadn't been looking for. An imagination forgetting to see and hear only that which has been seen and heard. This is how the future stayed alive and unfixed itself. It opened out the vernacular it already understood and made space for incoherence and discomfort, the known unknown. So my exuberance is not just about people of color being invited among you as program officers or grantees. It's about a remembering kind of imagination, being integral to the conversations you all have, no matter what your race. The conversation can happen without a person of color in the room, because one doesn't have to be me to understand the structural ways the conversation can have ended before any of us opened our mouth. One doesn't have to be me to know our tendency is to privilege certain utterances over others. What's in our bodies already wants to be supported. That makes sense. But desires should be questioned. Radical ideas are radical because they're new. One doesn't have to be me to know we're all projecting onto others our remembered imaginings. And these memories, understood as the imagination in play, can devastate, since the memories were formed under a system of white supremacy. One doesn't have to be me to know this, but one shouldn't need to be me to feel it at unexpected moments, in casual comments, in likes and dislikes, in patience and impatience, in exuberance and boredom. In order to better imagine, it's good to have a room that can hold all the memories, even the uncomfortable ones. It's good to make room in any room for a recognition that recognizes the value of a multiplication of knowledges. I wrote, what a sentence, to myself. In the room where well-intentioned statements might be challenged, the interest ought to be in the openings brought about by the challenges, rather than stuck in the accusation itself. In any room where patterns are recognized, they should be contested without needing to marry that to a culture of blame. White defensiveness and white fragility are two phrases that are making the rounds these days. They're usually considered as positions that get occupied when the imagination is challenged. This happens, I think, because challenge and blame feel like the same thing, but they're not the same thing. There is a history of institutional memories that frame our future imaginings, challenging a history that automatically positions the most well-intentioned of us shouldn't feel like a flood, or more simply, conversing shouldn't feel like drowning. The theorist and poet Fred Moten said that the people who are called white no more own whiteness than the people who are called black own blackness. We are what we are all after, or what we might all strive to be after, is a mode of existence that isn't about possessing in the sense of owning a strict idea of the imagination. What we remember in our hearts, but we might need each of us for the entirety of the imagined memory. Hobbes in the Leviathan couples the imagination with memory. And in another turn, he calls the imagination an understanding. This is a quote. The imagination that is raised in man, or in any other creature endured with the faculty of imagining by words or other voluntary signs, is that we generally call understanding. The idea that imagination, formed from our memories, at the end of the day, can be called an understanding brings me hope. It also brings me to this quote I read in Justin Lang's blog. Philanthropy is commendable, but it must not cause the philanthropist to overlook the circumstances of economic injustice which makes philanthropy necessary. How we understand the times that are creating us and how we imagine our way forward is one way art happens. And I'm happy you all are here living, watching, remembering, supporting, and understanding the arts in our time. Thank you.